Okay, we're live.
All right, welcome back to the House Environment Committee. We are going to shift gears and talk about emergency rulemaking as it pertains to our state being able to respond to changing federal environment.
This is Mike O'Grady. There's a document on your committee web page. It says draft 2.1 and with an H with no number after it. It's a 4/14 date and 9:35 a.m. timestamp. So just some context. So the Administrative Procedure Act establishes the requirements for state agencies adopting rules in the state when delegated by the General Assembly with the authority to adopt rules. And there are specific processes that a state agency must follow when they are adopting rules. They have to pre-file their proposed rule with the Secretary of State. Then they have to go out and do a public comment period. And then they have to put the draft out. And then they have to go to something called the Interagency Committee on Administrative Rules. And then they have to respond to any public comment that they've received at a public hearing or by writing. And then they have to submit a final proposed rule to the Secretary of State, who then submits it to the Legislative Committee on Administrative Rules. LCAR reviews the rule to see if it meets the LCAR factors. If it does meet the LCAR factors, it goes into effect 45 days after LCAR's approval or some subsequent effective date. If it doesn't meet LCAR's factors and LCAR objects, then the burden of proof is shifted to the state agency to prove the validity of the rule if there is litigation challenging the rule. So that is a fairly long process. It can take, if you do everything right according to all of the timing requirements at the exact time that the timing requirements would go into place, takes 5.5 months. No agency really meets the 5.5 months. It's more 8 to 9 months that it takes an agency to go through formal rulemaking. And remember, usually there's some form of pre-rulemaking before you start the formal process that an agency engages in. Well, sometimes situations arise where that time frame is not possible, and there needs to be a state action or authority that goes into effect immediately. And that authority is addressed in the Administrative Procedures Act, and it's called the Emergency Rulemaking Authority. And you can see in that document that's on your webpage in sub A of 3 VSA 844, the general standard is that there is an imminent peril to public health, safety, or welfare that requires adoption of an emergency rule. And it doesn't have to be pre-filed. It doesn't have to be have to do the notice and hearing. And the agency makes all reasonable efforts to ensure that the emergency rules are known to persons, but there is no requirement for response to comments, to public hearings, etc. Now, with that opportunity to put something into place without all the public participation and process, these rules are only in existence for 180 days. But remember, rulemaking can take up to 8 to 9 months. So sometimes, if not frequently, once you do one emergency rulemaking, the agency will propose to continue that rulemaking while they are going through formal rulemaking. So an emergency rule can only last for 180 days, but LCAR can approve it to be implemented for longer.
Actually, and I just want to reiterate, or I'm not sure, maybe I missed it in this language, but emergency rules still go to LCAR before they go into effect.
Yes, and you will see that in the next subsection down. They are filed with the Secretary of State and with LCAR. They shall distribute copies of the emergency rules to the standing committees, and then they have to include certain amount of information. And then on a majority vote of the entire committee, the committee, meaning LCAR, can object to an emergency rule as beyond the agency's authority, contrary to the intent of the legislature, arbitrary, or not necessitated by an imminent peril to public health, safety, or welfare sufficient to justify adoption of an emergency rule. So that's how emergency rule is done. In this committee, it used to happen every year when the migratory bird treaty limits were issued, because the feds issue those and they issue them in like late August and September, but hunting seasons in September and October. So they had to go to emergency rulemaking to set them. It just wasn't happening some years. And so what happened is the General Assembly gave the department the ability to set those migratory bird treaty limits by procedure. And the agency can turn them around in like 30 days. So you don't see it in this committee that often. It often happens in things like DCF, AHS, where something happens quickly, funding runs out, there's a exigent circumstances where authority doesn't exist, and there's a need for response. Corrections has happened sometimes in corrections. Now, there is a situation where in the existing emergency rule authority that is applicable to almost every state agency where emergency rules or emergency amendments might be enacted. And that is when on page 4, line 4, the existing rules implement a program controlled by federal statute or rule. The controlling federal statute or rule has been amended to require a change in the program or the multi-state entity. The controlling federal statute or rule requires implementation of the change within 120 days. And the adopting authority finds each of the following in writing. The agency cannot, by the date required, implement the final rule, and failure to amend the rules by the date required for implementation would cause significant harm to the public health, safety, or welfare, or significant financial loss to the state. Now, you're in a situation right now with the federal government rescinding programs, rescinding grants, rescinding financing, eliminating programs, and they're not providing dates. They're not saying it has to be done within 120 days. They are just eliminating programs. And that doesn't fall underneath this existing authority in sub G. So what is being proposed, and it was proposed by the agency after the chair reached out to them and said, what programs do you need support for if something's going to be rescinded or funding? And they don't know if anything's going to be rescinded or funding's going to evaporate, but they're concerned enough that they offer this language, which would apply to all state agencies. So in addition to the grounds for emergency rulemaking that's already in statute, the imminent peril to public health, safety, or the environment, or the federal government has made a change that requires response within 120 days, an agency may adopt an emergency rule if an amendment to a federal statute, rule, or policy will materially conflict with or threaten the ability of the agency to implement a statutory or regulatory program required under Vermont law. The committee, LCAR, may object to proposed emergency rules for adoption under this section on the basis that the provision of the subsection do not apply. So an agency can't just argue that the federal amendment is going to conflict with their ability to do something when it does not. There still needs to be proof that is offered as part of the emergency rulemaking process. Remember, it is 180 days. That rule only exists for 180 days with the opportunity for renewal. And I want to clarify that this would apply to all state agencies, because on page 5, line 4, although agency is capitalized, it probably shouldn't, there is a definition of agency in the Administrative Procedure Act. And it means state board, commission, department, agency, or other entity of state government other than the legislature, the courts, or the military department. So this, any agency, any state agency would be able to exercise this emergency rulemaking if there was an amendment to federal statute, rule, or policy that would materially conflict with the ability of the agency to run a program. So think, for example, water and sewer funding. It is largely funded through the federal government in an annual appropriation under either the Clean Water Act or the Safe Drinking Water Act. Agency of Natural Resources has an entire program, including a rule that sets up the process, the review, how points are assessed, the priority that municipalities are given. But the state cost shares that money. So if that money was repealed, revoked, etc., how is the agency going to move that money in a fiscal year? It's really not certain, because they would have some money. They would have the state money that was put up for the cost share, but they wouldn't have enough money to implement their priority rule. And so how would they allocate that money? They would have the ability to go to an emergency rulemaking to come up with something that would address those requirements in the interim while they were working on a permanent amendment to the rule on how to allocate the money. So it's not a cure-all. It's a Band-Aid that gives them time to implement a program or to continue to administer a program while they seek a fix. Now, this whole authority would be repealed in July 1, 2028. I just did 3 years. You can change that date to whatever you want. And I did 3 years because of basically 3 permanent rulemaking cycles will put you out at 3 years.
Members have questions. Representative Pritchard.
I guess I'm really not understanding this well. So are you saying that in lieu of loss of federal funds, that this would allow the state to allocate those funds? And if so, I'm assuming those funds are from Vermont taxpayers. They would be subsidizing the loss of the federal funds. And it's giving them the authority to do that.
So the example that I gave, you appropriate that money for that use for water and sewer, and you give the Agency of Natural Resources the ability to grant that to municipality. So you've already exercised the constitutional legislative authority to approve that appropriation. There is no delegation of that appropriation authority to A&R that you haven't already delegated.
Which contains state and federal funds.
Which contains state and federal.
Okay.
But now you're going to, the federal funds will be minimized or eliminated. How does the agency move those state monies underneath the program that you've already appropriated that money for?
Just the state money?
Well, it's any money, and it's in the state revolving loan fund. All right, so because it's a revolving loan fund, at any one time, it's going to include more than just that annual appropriation, because it's a bank. They lend out money, they take money back, they get more money in from the feds and from the state, they lend that out, they take it back. So there's more in that revolving loan fund each year than just that annual appropriation. So you got to figure out how to move that money potentially. And it's not just money, it could be food stamps, right? Who's going to qualify, because USDA is a large contributor of the money that's used for food stamps and for the eligibility. They could change the eligibility. They could change how those food stamps are issued. And I'm not using the proper term. Food stamps is not the proper term anymore.
SNAP.
So if that was changed and it would, the federal requirements would restrict or eliminate or somehow control to a way that the state could not implement the program as is required under state law, leaving aside the feds potentially preempting the state, and that's still a possibility. The state could go to rulemaking to figure out a bridge to a more permanent solution. A permanent solution could come through permanent rulemaking. Maybe it comes through legislation at the state level. This is just a Band-Aid or a bridge to a more permanent solution.
Representative Austin.
I have two questions. One is, how are members of LCAR chosen?
They're appointed by the House and the House Speaker, and then the Senate Committee on Committees.
And then, yeah, is the funding, the revolving funding, is it prioritized? Like, what if, 2 or 3 different agencies need have?
Well, I was only talking about one revolving loan fund,
Yeah,
and that's only run by A&R.
That was just an example, everyone. That's not, like, it didn't happen.
right. But I'm just saying, if it does happen, I'm just wondering, how is it prioritized? What if ANR and
Well, that's,
Health and Human Services all have funding cut? How do they, and we don't have enough
well,
money?
that's a different question,
Okay.
because that money's already been appropriated.
Back.
But you would have to come back to the General Assembly, and you would probably have to do a budget adjustment to address how you were going to reallocate money. If you don't come back, then the question in my example is, how is A&R going to prioritize the money that it has to award for the long list of applicants? Are they going to give Burlington money to fix the wastewater treatment line under the Winooski?
Okay, I see.
Are they going to give Rutland money to fix the combined sewer overflows in Rutland? It's like, so that there has to be, usually they have a whole rule that dictates how all that's going to happen. If you take away the money that drives that rule, what happens?
You stop spending it.
Or,
That's what
well,
I
you
do.
still have to prioritize it.
Yeah.
Right? You still have to, there are still some needs that are going to be priority, immediate
Yeah.
needs.
Yeah, I understand.
Representative Logan.
Thank you. So barring us returning for a special session to pass a BA, an emergency BAA or something like that, this would authorize
It gives the agents,
agencies the ability to write the emergency rules they need to implement programming under a emergency budget constraint.
for 180 days, and then potentially with the continuation of that or 2 until rulemaking or legislation provides a permanent solution.
But not just rulemaking,
Representative Pritchard.
but not just rulemaking, spending. Also,
No.
correct?
No, the spend,
Well, that's what I'm trying to understand.
the spending spending authority. In my example, the spending authority is already there. Right? They already have the authority to run the SRF, this revolving loan fund, and to move the money. You've already given them that spending authority, and they exercise it on an annual basis. So it's how they would exercise that authority that you've already given them with the money that is there. And it would apply to other programs as well. How do they do this when the federal support, whether it's staff, money, or otherwise, is not there? There are federal staff that do support what the state does. Fish and Wildlife Service, what they do to support some of the Department of Fish and Wildlife. What happens if the Department of Fish and Wildlife is planning to be supported by Fish and Wildlife Service? Does that prevent them from implementing the program? Does the department have another way that they could pivot to implement a program without Fish and Wildlife Services support? I mean, I can't give you like every alternative because I can't predict what's going to happen.
This is a tool for state government to be able to respond when they need to quickly to a changing environment, changing relationship with the federal government. Basically. Representative Austin.
This is like a big picture question. Thanks, don't yell. Um, that's our money. That's our tax money. We pay I just paid a huge amount of federal taxes yesterday. What is the relationship between state, taxpayers and the use of their funding? I mean, how can the federal government withhold money that we've paid into, right? Just
Well,
on a very broad level.
Well, it's ultimately something that Congress has to approve.
Mhm.
Although a lot of what has been happening is the administration, the executive branch, stopping a program, eliminating a program, not allowing for money to be spent when it's been approved by the Congress. I think that those are constitutional questions that are in front of the courts right now about how those powers interact. Generally, when Congress approves an appropriation, it's supposed to be spent with realities. Obviously, you see those realities every year in the Budget Adjustment Act. When you appropriate money, sometimes things don't get spent because of issues or staffing or weather or whatever. You have that same dynamic at the federal level. They will come back and they do a reconciliation as well of their budget. But they are generally supposed to spend the money that's appropriated for the purposes that it's appropriated for. The executive branch has the ability to implement those programs that are funded and appropriated for, but those are the questions that are being worked out right now. And how far is the executive branch authority for a program that's already been funded?
Further questions? Thank you, Michael.
Right.
Representative North.
Question. Why is this bill with us? This seems like a judiciary kind of thing. It doesn't seem right.
It's related to all committees.
Right.
And I asked for it. And every committee we'll be talking about it. We're finding our way in how to respond to a dynamic environment.
Okay, so we're not the only, this is not like this bill is with us as an environment. This is something proposed at all.
I'm the one that asked for the draft amendment, so it extends further than that, but someone had to do it. So. I don't know if there's a vehicle for it right now. So that's what you're thinking, like awareness and a knowledge and understanding of where we're at. Okay, moving on.
To an easier subject. I am preparing myself. So you may or may not know that on April 8th, the President Trump's administration issued an executive order called Protecting American Energy from State Overreach. It is a very broad and very vague expression of opposition to state laws that somehow, as the order asserts, are a impediment to the identification, development, siting, production, investment, and or use of domestic energy resources. And it references a Vermont Act that was enacted last year. And you have on your website a summary of that act, the act summary for Act 122. And that act is called an act relating to climate change cost recovery. And you can see from the act summary that the purpose of that bill, that act, was to hold parties responsible for covered greenhouse gas emissions between the covered period of January 1, 1995 and December 31st, 2024, where that entity's share of the state's cost of climate change. So those fossil fuel extractors or crude oil refiners that had 1 billion metric tons or more of covered greenhouse gases during the covered period will be assessed what's called a cost recovery payment to pay or reimburse Vermont for the cost of climate change that those greenhouse gas emissions caused. Now, there's a whole state treasurer report that is being conducted to assess and account for the cost, including the cost of running the program, including the feasibility of running the program. ANR is adopting a rule to implement the program. They're already in the process of implementing what's called the Climate Resilience Strategy, which is going to be a basis for the projects that would be implemented once cost recovery payments start coming in to a special fund. So this is an act that is referenced in President Trump's executive order from April 8th. So let's now just walk through the executive order, and I'm going to either raise questions or provide a counterpoint. I'd like to do this conversationally. I don't want to write anything down because it is really broad and really vague. And I don't really know what some of the things reference, some of the statements are and what they reference. So first, the purpose section of the order. The Trump administration is committed to unleashing American energy, especially through the removal of all illegitimate impediments to the identification, development, siting, production, investment in, or use of domestic energy resources. All right, so I don't know what an illegitimate impediment is. State laws are enacted under the 10th Amendment to the Constitution, which allows states to legislate in those areas where Congress has not. And all states do it, and almost all states have some regulatory program for energy production and siting. Vermont has one, but Act 122 from last year is not related to siting. It's not related to production. It's not related to development. It's not related to land use for energy production. It's not related to distribution. So I don't know really what an illegitimate impediment would be. And then it goes on to say in the next paragraph down, American energy dominance is threatened when state and local governments seek to regulate energy beyond their constitutional or statutory authority. Well, if it is beyond their constitutional or statutory authorities, that's a legitimate statement. That is true. But what the executive order goes on to reference are state laws that were enacted under legitimate 10th Amendment authority that states have. So when state and local governments seek to regulate beyond their constitutional statutory authorities, the courts are the ones that are supposed to interpret whether or not the state has done so. Because the General Assembly legislates, the executive branch implements and administers, the courts interpret and apply. And so any law that could be beyond constitutional or statutory authorities should be before a court to determine whether or not it is beyond constitutional or statutory authorities, and then to respond to how the court directs that that infirmity to be resolved. But going down, there's an example. For example, when states target or discriminate against out-of-state energy producers by imposing significant barriers to interstate and international trade, American energy suffers and the equality of each state enshrined by the Constitution is undermined. What are the barriers? I don't know what the barriers are. That might be a legitimate statement. What are the barriers? I don't know. And similarly, when states subject energy producers to arbitrary or excessive fines, to retroactive penalties, or seek to control energy development, siting, or production activities on federal land, American energy suffers. Okay. Well, we don't have any federal land in Vermont, or very, very little of it, and definitely not where any real energy is produced. So I'm gonna ignore that last part. But that Act 122 is an act that applied retroactively to the cover period of 1994 to 2025. You can act retroactively. Retroactive law is okay. Generally, law is supposed to be prospective in application into the future. But if the state has a legitimate interest and announces clearly the application of it retroactively, retroactive laws are generally held to be constitutional unless they are unduly harsh or oppressive. So just keep that in mind because I'm going to come back to that. So many states have enacted or are in the process of enacting burdensome, ideologically motivated climate change or energy policies that threaten American dominance and our economic and national security. I think states are adopting ideologically motivated climate change. Are they potentially burdensome? They could be. Are they illegal or unconstitutional? I don't know. That's up for a court to decide. But then the order gives examples. New York, for example, enacted a climate change extortion law that seeks to retroactively impose billions in fines on traditional energy producers for their purported past contributions to greenhouse gas emissions, not only in New York, but also anywhere in the United States and the world. And then Vermont similarly extorts energy producers for alleged past contributions to greenhouse gas emissions anywhere in the United States or the globe.
What is extortion?
Extortion is the practice of obtaining something, especially money, through force or threats, usually of an illegal nature. So you threaten someone with something illegal or criminal in order for them to do something, usually provide money. So Vermont has not threatened the energy producers. They can continue to supply and distribute and manufacture in the state. They're not doing anything that, in my opinion, is illegal. Seeking cost reimbursement, in my opinion, is not illegal, but that will be up for a court to decide ultimately. So I don't think Act 122 from last year is extortion. But apparently there's a different opinion. And then there's discussion of other states, the different approaches other states have taken about forcing businesses to pay trading credits or creating permitting requirements, or there are references to state actions under nuisance or other tort regimes that could result in crippling damages. So again, Act 122, unrelated to production, unrelated to trade or distribution, ongoing trade or distribution unrelated to production or siting. The Vermont Attorney General has filed a consumer protection case against fossil fuel producers, oil producers. And it's based on effectively what's being called greenwashing, but that the companies knew of potential harms, knew of damages being caused, and did not provide that information to the public in a way that was consumer deception. That litigation was filed in 2021. It just was approved as ongoing in 2025, January of 2025. And I believe the Attorney General said it's probably going to take several more years to resolve. So moving down, it states that these laws and policies also undermine federalism by projecting the regulatory preferences of a few states into all states. I don't know what that is in regard to. Again, in Vermont, under Act 122, it is specifically limited to those refiners and extractors who have what are called regulatory contacts with the state. Regulatory contacts mean that they engaged in activity of a nature and a type that availed themselves of the jurisdiction of the state, and that activity should have been known to be availing themselves of the jurisdiction of the state. And so there will be refiners, extractors that are not going to have regulatory contacts with Vermont because Indian coal doesn't distribute into Vermont, right? But there may be other coal companies that do and knew through their distribution networks that their products were being sold in Vermont. That is a regulatory contact. The US Supreme Court and the Vermont Supreme Court said that the use of distribution systems for expected, planned distribution of product is sufficient to create regulatory contacts. So there's that. I don't see how federalism is undermined because if there is a federal law that applies, there's something called preemption, and preemption doesn't have to be explicit. There can be conflict preemption or implied preemption. And so if there is a federal law that's applying, I don't see how federalism would be undermined. And if there isn't a federal law that applies, well, that's where the 10th Amendment to the Constitution allows states to regulate. Where the federal government hasn't acted, the state can. And then moving down, I want to talk about excessive fines. Excessive fines is one of the arguments that's being made in the litigation against Act 122, and I assume against New York. Excessive fines is a clause in the US Constitution under the cruel and unusual punishment law where people should be free from excessive fines. And excessive fines generally are, a fine is deemed to be excessive when it's determined to be punishment. And it doesn't have to be solely punishment. It can be partly remedial, it can be partly punishment, but there has to be a determination that it's being applied out of proportion to the violation, strictly for punishment or partly for punishment. That will be part of the litigation about Act 122. It was looked at when the General Assembly enacted 122 last year. Remember that the program is based on reimbursing the state for the costs, the damages caused by greenhouse gases. It is remedial in nature. It is assessed based on the ratio of each producer's share So it is not something where they're going to be jointly liable for all damages. It's just they're going to be liable for their share. And that cost recovery payment is going to be used for projects, climate remedial projects that will address those harms. So there's a very good argument that it is not punishment, that it is remedial, that the companies were aware of the harm that they were causing and continued to cause that harm. And so that'll be an issue, but again, it's an issue before the courts, and it's up to the courts to decide that. But in section 2 of the order, page 2, the Attorney General is directed to identify all state and local laws, regulations, causes of action, policies, and practices burdening the identification, development, siting, production, or use of domestic energy resources that are or may be unconstitutional, preempted by federal law, or otherwise unenforceable. So I don't know what that means. That's a big directive. That's a lot of authority. So state and local laws that burden the identification, development, setting. What does burden? Let's talk about Vermont. In Vermont, for you to be an energy producer, generator, etc., somebody regulated by the PUC, you need a Section 248 certification. That's not that, the simplest thing. Is that a burden to development, siting, protection for use? I don't know. I expect some people think it is. What about Clean Water Act Section 401 certifications? Whenever a federal permit is going to be issued, the state has to issue a Clean Water Act 401 certification that the federal permit is going to comply with the water quality standards of that state. States have different water quality standards. There's different application. In some states, you can get hydroelectric permits. In some states, you cannot. Is that a burden to energy production? I don't know. And is that even a state law? Because it's the state issuing the certification, but it's under the federal law. So I don't know the universe of what's going to be looked at, or the scope, meaning like the nature of the activity regulated. And then coming back, the Attorney General, she is supposed to identify those laws that are unconstitutional, preempted by federal law, or otherwise unenforceable. Well, if they're preempted by federal law, she definitely has a role there to go out and say, this is preempted, and I'm going to seek estoppel of state laws that are preempted. That is definitely her role. But she's not the one that identifies what's unconstitutional or otherwise unenforceable. I don't know what otherwise unenforceable means.
This is the federal AG though, right? Not.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Attorney General Bondi. And then she is supposed to prioritize the identification of any such state laws purporting to address climate change or involving environmental, social, and governance initiatives. So climate change laws are going to be on the top line for identification. And then she's expeditiously going to take all appropriate action to stop enforcement of state laws and continuation of civil actions identified in the subject. I don't know what that means, because that's what courts do. If it's already a cause of action in the courts, is she going to intervene? Is she going to file what are called amicus briefs. I don't know. So that'll be really interesting, but she's supposed to do all of this within the next 60 days.
For 50 states.
Correct. And inform the president about what is going to happen. I will say, I think there's a really relevant directive to Attorney General Bondi is that she shall recommend any additional presidential or legislative action necessary to stop the enforcement of state laws identified. I think legislative action, that's an appropriate route. If she thinks that there needs to be legislative action to stop some of these state laws, that is appropriate. That is what attorney generals will do. They will say, hey, in this instance, we think there needs to be a broader application of law across state boundaries. It needs to be federal. We need to preempt the states. That's legitimate. And maybe that's what comes of that. And I think that's well within Congress's authority, and it's well within her authority to recommend that. And I think that that's legit. But I don't know. I just don't know. And I'm not trying to be judgmental. I literally just don't know what is going to be recommended. And how things that are determined to be illegal or impediments are going to be stopped. I don't know. It's not clear. And so that's really it. The section 3 is just kind of general provisions about how it's not going to apply to certain things. Doesn't affect rights or benefits or anything enforceable under law. But it's interesting. It's really, I'm gonna be really interested, curious to see what happens in 54 days. And then maybe you'll need that emergency rulemaking authority more than you thought you did. So I don't know. I don't need to be flippant, sorry.
So one of the things I'm hearing you say, though, is that this is just articulating kind of standard practice that the Attorney General already does. I mean, presumably they're always monitoring state laws to make sure that they're not at cross purposes to federal laws.
Yeah, I mean, when states are trying to implement a law that conflicts with federal law, that's partly what U.S. attorneys around the country are supposed to review. And I mean, they write letters. They say, hey, this law is in conflict with federal law, recommend remedy or amendment. We've received a couple of those in the past.
From the feds.
Yeah. And that happens.
Do you remember on what topics?
Oh, I can't. I can probably find the letters.
Do members have questions? Representative Logan.
Thanks. So it seems to me like there's nothing, we should do nothing.
I don't know what to do.
Yeah.
I mean, there's not enough information.
Right.
To respond, not enough information as to know what will happen in order to respond.
And it seems like this hinges upon a couple phrases in here, like relative to the work that we've done here in Vermont. And there might be more, like you mentioned, other parts of environmental law, but regarding the Act 122.
There's Act 122, there's the Attorney General's ongoing consumer protection cause of action, because remember, Attorney General Bondi is supposed to identify the causes of actions that are impediments.
Mhm.
And then that broad statement about any other thing that could be restricting American energy dominance. It's like, I don't know what that means.
Specifically related to Act 122 from the comments that you've made here along the way, it doesn't, despite the phrase Vermont extorts energy producers, blah, blah, blah. It doesn't seem like we have done anything wrong.
Well, that's, I'm not gonna speak for everybody in there, but it's like, that was the argument that was made when we enacted Act 122, that what the state was doing was exercising its 10th Amendment authority to regulate, and it's called the Climate Superfund Law, and for a reason, because there is this program called Superfund. Does everybody know what Superfund is? It's if there's a hazardous materials release on your property under federal and state law, or two different laws, federal and state, the owner, operator, arranger, transporter, those are four different categories, can be jointly and severally liable for cleaning up, for the cost of cleaning up the entire hazardous materials release. And that is retroactive to the World War II, at least. And it has been applied regardless of fault of the owner operator. And it has been held to be constitutional by multiple courts. It has not been held to be harsh or oppressive and violate due process. And this law would not be nearly as retroactive. It only goes back to 1994. It would not go back so far to a point where the refiners or the extractors would have a legitimate argument that they didn't know what the harms were. In 1994 and subsequently, the harms were fairly well known in the scientific community. And so, and it's not jointly and several either. It's they don't have to pay for everybody's liability like under Superfund, under CERCLA, where if there's just one deep pocket, the deep pocket has to pay for everything. It's about their cost share. And it's about that cost share related to the harm that they cause, that ratio. So there are definitely going to be arguments. There definitely have been arguments. I think we've touched on most of them. Process, retroactivity, excessive fines, Commerce Clause. And that's what the courts are going to decide. Unless Congress enters and legislates to preempt. But what is unanswered is like what between the court action that's ongoing, legislative preemption, what is the Attorney General going to do between them? And that's going to be the curious thing to see.
Representative Chapin.
I guess I totally understand Act 2022. We knew that was going to be litigated in courts. No surprises there. I'm wondering how you think this could potentially impact, Act 250, citing regulations, things that have been in place for decades. Do you feel like this is broad enough that the federal government could take actions, withhold funding, bring to court?
I do. I think it's broad enough that if someone made an argument to the Attorney General that a state law restricted energy development or distribution or production, that the Attorney General would have authority under this to act on that. And so in one way that's concerning because local control, local regulation of land use and energy are pretty consistently implemented across all states. There's varying degrees of regulation, obviously, but almost every state has. No state has free, you can do whatever energy production you want to do, wherever you want to do it, however you want to do it. And those states that were like in that realm for a little bit, like fracking in Pennsylvania for a while, they pulled back on that and put more structure around those programs. But it doesn't limit them, or I don't know, it doesn't prevent that. So I don't know. We'll see what happens. But I can make arguments. That's what I'm trained to do. I can make arguments.
Other questions? Representative Austin?
Yep. You might have, addressed this, but in, small c, a, of this section that the Attorney General determines to be illegal, is the Attorney General, does she or he, do they determine whether something's illegal, or do the courts?
No, they don't determine if it's illegal. They can administer a statute that dictates that something's illegal. So if they identified some activity is illegal under federal law, they can bring a cause of action or indictment. And they would do that in the courts.
Mhm.
So that is authority, but to deem it illegal, and maybe that's just not the clearest writing. But you could interpret that as that her authority is somehow superseding the courts, but you could also interpret it as her bringing indictments or causes of actions of her own. So it's a little, that's unclear. I don't know what that means.
Right. Thank you, Michael. That concludes our work for today. We'll see you in the morning at 9 o'clock.